Hello, and welcome to the eTech podcast with me, your host, Ryan Maughan. I have been involved in the development of electrified vehicles and machines since 2005 as an engineer and a business leader. This podcast is the product of my passion for electric and autonomous vehicle technology. I'm here to share knowledge from some of the world's leading experts, as well as my own insights. Join me as we accelerate the transition to cleaner, safer and smarter vehicles and grow the industry around the world. Welcome to the Avid Technology podcast with me, Ryan Maughan. Today we've got a really interesting episode coming. I've got with me via the wonders of the internet, Gerard Barron, who is the CEO of an absolutely fascinating company in a field which is going to be quite important potentially in the future for electric and hybrid vehicles. Gerard has a business called DeepGreen Metals, and they are looking at really sort of sustainable, environmentally friendly ways of recovering specialist metals from the ocean. So welcome, Gerard.
Thank you very much, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
I just wonder if we could start, Gerard, with a bit of background on your good self. If you could tell us where you've come from and how you've got to where you are today.
Yeah, happy to. So, I'm Australian. Grew up on a dairy farm in Queensland and was always destined to be an entrepreneur. I started my first company at university many years ago now, and I've been lucky enough to build some great companies since, ranging from making automotive batteries in China in the early 90s and built a distribution network around Europe and into Australia, which I sold that company back to a Chinese corporation, and had a telecommunications business in Australia, which sold to Singtel. And then I started a software as a service business, which in 2001, which is what brought me to London. I had to grow the company, and it was either New York or London, and London won out. And, thinking I'd be here for a couple of years, and I've kept a base here ever since. And so, yeah. And then I wasn't, so none of that sounds much like Ocean Metals.
Yep.
But I was always a very curious investor. And so way back in 2001, there was a company started called Nautilus Minerals. And a friend of mine was running it, and they needed some money. And I foolishly thought, yes, that's a great idea. Made so much sense to me collecting metals from the ocean compared to ripping up pristine, biodiverse ecosystems. And so I agreed to, underwrite some capital and help the company go on. They ended up raising a lot of money and floated the company, and I sold out soon after. And for me, it was an amazing transaction. But its gift to me was it taught me about nodules, because that company, Nautilus, were focused on sulfides, and nodules are a very different resource. And so then in 2011, DeepGreen was formed, and I was originally the provider of capital, and I helped the company raise all its money. Didn't think I could run a resources company, but as I got more involved with the CEO that we had hired, I realized that actually maybe my skill sets were appropriate. And because this is a challenge of strategy and of communication and earning the social license. And I reached that time in my life, some call it a midlife crisis, but it was just a time to reflect on, what are we doing for the planet? How can we make a difference? And, I knew that this was a big, difficult, almost impossible challenge. And I like those, and here I am. So I became chairman and CEO a few years ago, and been having a hoot ever since.
And just so if you could just help me explain nodules and what they are and what you do with them.
Yeah, well. Firstly, the oceans are filled with metals. I think most people know that now. And they come in several forms. There are sulfides, like I talked about, and they really form where the tectonic plates meet, like chimneys underwater. And then you have these seafloor crusts, which are molten that spews out of the core of the Earth and spreads over very large areas. And we're not focused on those because to recover those metals, you need to go and mine them. You've got to go down with big, nasty machines and turn big rocks into little rocks and pump them to the surface. And then there's a third category, and the third category are polymetallic nodules. And nodules grow a little bit like a pearl grows. They precipitate the metals that are both in the seawater and also are in the sediments on the seafloor. And think of them as a pearl, how a pearl grows. And so they're found in a variety of locations. They were discovered way back in the 1860s by an expedition, HMS Challenger, funded by the Royal Society. And they wanted to know what lay on the bottom of the ocean. And so with the benefit of the steam piston that had been developed, they sailed around the world with a dredge off the back of the boat, and they recovered these nodules from a variety of locations. But it's the area known as the Clarion-Clipperton zone that's most interesting, and that's because it benefited from the runoff from the Rockies and the Andes. And so all these metals and minerals were deposited in the seawater and on the sediment and provided the feedstock for these nodules to grow. And if I was with you, I'd hand you one. Think of it as the size of a potato. Okay. So large potatoes and small potatoes. And they literally just sit on the ocean floor. So a very unique resource. And so we don't have to drill or dig for them. We have to collect them.
And that's where, because actually the sort of underwater mining industry, ocean mining, it can be a bit controversial, can't it? You know, people I think have quite negative perceptions of you know, like you said earlier, kind of big machines and turning big rocks into little rocks and all the rest of it. But these are lying abundant in
some areas,
right.
And so you need a specific breeding ground or production area, and that's based on the depth. So we're about 4,000 meters below sea level, and you're right that there are opponents to doing anything in the ocean, and I can understand why people can at times be skeptical, because we've seen what land mining has done to the planet, and it's been pretty horrible. And so people may naturally think, well, I assume it'll be the same horrible mess in the ocean, but it's, in fact, we believe it to be the exact opposite, and that, you know, Mother Nature made this very large resource, this very large abundant resource, and in these nodules contain all of the metals we need to build batteries. And of course now we want to move away from fossil fuels, but when you look at the impacts of us doing that, we're going to need to build hundreds of millions, maybe billions of batteries to put into our cars, to put into our homes, to build the renewable power stations and the storage off the back of that. And that's an entirely new demand category. And the question for society is, where should we get that from?
Yeah.
And that's
what kind of metals are in, I mean, is there a particular kind of metals that you would find in the nodules, or is it a sort of fairly broad spectrum?
Yeah, so not all nodules are made equally, but in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, think of them as an 811 NMC battery in a rock.
Oh, wow.
So, Ryan, I know you know the electric vehicle industry well, and you know that the battery cathode is pretty well settled around NMC. Yeah. And more manufacturers are moving to 8 parts nickel to 1 part cobalt, 1 part manganese. And amazingly, these nodules have 8 parts nickel to 1 part cobalt. They have a lot of manganese, and they also have a lot of copper, which we're going to need a lot of for the green transition as well. So, you know, it's a very appropriate and abundant resource for the era that we're about to move through.
Wow. And I guess you mentioned earlier they're at 4,000 meters depth. So we've only, I mean, do we I was about to say we've only just developed the technology to sort of go and find these things, but I don't even know. Do we have the technology to go to 4,000 meters and recover?
Well, the good news is, yes, we do. And if we wind the clock back a little bit, so back in the 1860s, HMS Challenger went looking. And then in the 1970s, the industry started to collect these nodules. So they built the Glomar Explorer. Many people will know that name. And the Glomar Explorer was the vessel upon which ocean metals were about to become a new industry. There were 4 different consortiums, and many of the great resource companies were involved: Shell and Rio Tinto and Lockheed Martin, Mitsubishi.
Right.
And they built these harvesters that went 4,000 meters underwater. And if you go online, you can find references to them on YouTube. And basically, they proved that the technology was there. But way back in the 1970s, it hadn't been agreed who owned the oceans. And so it wasn't until 1982 that the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea was finally agreed. And so what happened to those pioneers in the way back in the 70s is they had to stop what they were doing. The United Nations basically said, no, you cannot claim this part of the ocean. And so without security of title, they had to put it down to an interesting experiment. And of course, the mining companies went looking for resources on land, and the oil and gas companies went looking offshore for more oil and gas and so on. And so, yeah, it's interesting that it's taken all this time, and now we're on the doorstep of the industry being open for business.
Wow. I have just done exactly what you said and gone to look for the Glomar Explorer, and wow, that looks like the kind of thing that there'll be a movie made about at some point in the future, or maybe there even already has been a movie made about tale of secrets.
As if it wasn't an exciting story or enough already. There's one more exciting element, and that is that the CIA were originally involved because they were trying to recover a sunken Russian submarine, and the U.S. had listening devices in the Pacific Ocean, and so they picked up a stress alert from this Russian sub, so they knew where it was. But they needed a cover to go looking for the submarine, and so they said, let's go and collect those nodules. And so Howard Hughes was involved, and the BBC recently published an article about it, and and there has been a movie made about it as well, which is available on Netflix. So it's fascinating.
I'll have to check that out. So, and the technology that you're using now or proposing to use, is it the same kind of recovery technology, or is it?
It's amazingly similar, and but of course, let's think what's happened since the mid-1970s. The offshore oil and gas industry, has gone further into deep waters. The cable laying and trenching and pipeline industries in the deep ocean have become very, very big industries. And so, the technology available to us today in 2020 is significantly enhanced compared to what was developed back in the mid-70s. And to that point, some of our shareholders come out of that industry. We have Maersk, the shipping company, but who are also very diversified in drilling and offshore oil and gas services. And we also, last year, struck an arrangement with a company called Allseas to invest in the company and also to help us build our pilot mining system. And Allseas are one of the most highly regarded and largest layers of pipe for the offshore oil and gas industry. And we're very pleased and proud to have them as our partners on this project.
Wow, brilliant. So basically, then there's the potential to recover vast amounts of the right kind of materials from these nodules from the ocean floor in a manner that is, how from a sustainability point of view, like how it's difficult, isn't it? I guess because so we were, before we got started recording, we were sort of just sharing stories. And I grew up in the northeast of England, and coal mining was actually my family's thing. So I kind of spent a lot of time in open pit mines, open cast mines up here in the family business. My the business was located underneath a big coal pile of a coal-fired power station. I look at wind turbines as things of beauty, because compared to coal power stations and coal mining, but they still obviously have a negative environmental impact potentially, and a lot of people absolutely despise them. So there's yes. I'm getting into this delicately, because I know there's probably lots of different sides to this, but from an environmental perspective, what's your take?
Well, let's not be too delicate. Let's face the facts. Every single thing we do on this planet has an impact.
Yeah.
And collecting metals from the bottom of the ocean will be the same. Like, I can tell you why collecting them, as opposed to mining for sulfides and seafloor crusts, I can tell you why collecting nodules is the best alternative, but it will still have an impact.
Right.
If you're a lot of the organisms are microorganisms that will, live in the seafloor. We're actually just going to stir that up, whether they'll just pass through our system and, they'll come out the back end of it. But if you're a worm living, or a sea cucumber that's sitting on one of our nodules that gets collected, then, you're probably going to find, the party's over.
Yeah.
And 4,000 meters below sea level it's an interesting area, because, we have thousands and thousands. I mean, one of our blocks is 75,000 square kilometers, and we've surveyed all of it.
Wow.
And so, it is called the abyssal plain. It's the most common environment on the planet. It just happens to be on the ocean floor. And so
the abyssal plain.
The abyssal plain, yeah.
That sounds like, kind of great holiday destination.
Yes, in fact, there is one trip review on the there's only one comment. He said, "Man, it's dead out here. Nothing going on." That's right.
Yeah,
there's not a lot happening.
75? Did you say 75,000 square miles or kilometers?
Yeah.
75,000. God, that's a lot. What's the?
And we have 3 of those licensed areas, and
you know how people like to put things into context of football pitches or the multiples of Wales. What's the 75,000 square kilometers? What would that be equivalent to? Is that sort of?
That's a really good question. Scotland.
Yeah. Okay. So big, huge surface area. Yeah. Okay.
Very big, and also, there's not much food down there, because at 4,000 meters, you don't find large organisms. You'll see sometimes pictures about when people talk about this industry, and there'll be pictures of coral. There are no colorful corals at this area. There are no, we've never ever seen an organism larger than my thumb down there. Like, there's not a lot of food. Now, of course, there are microorganisms that might live on the nodule or live in the soils, and we're not being disrespectful to those. But let me go back to what we talked about, and that is every single thing that we do on this planet has an impact. And the question is, what's the alternative? What's the impact of where we get our battery materials from right now? And what we're in the process of doing is all of the environmental research. We have the world's largest ocean floor to ocean surface research study underway right now. Why are we doing that? Because we have to prepare our environmental impact assessment on what will the impact be, not just on the ocean floor, but all the way through the water columns. And so we're doing that work today. And but of course, what we do know, Ryan, is what are the externalities of land-based mining?
Yeah.
Firstly, if we think about those electric vehicle batteries, 8 parts nickel. The number 1 country exporting nickel is Indonesia. And the nickel is coming out of some of the most biodiverse areas on the planet. I think officially, Indonesia is the 3rd most biodiverse area on the planet. And so that means that we're ripping down our carbon sinks, who happen to be our rainforests. We're destroying species at an alarming rate. And these aren't worms that live in the soil, because the land-based mining industry stops measuring things at about 40 centimeters. We're measuring things at fraction of a millimeter. And so when you see side-by-side comparisons, they're not really very fair, because we're not saying, these organisms aren't important. That's why big areas of this CCZ, the Clarion-Clipperton zone, have been put aside in preservation zones. About a third of the area has already been put aside, and it will be increased. So never to go there, never to collect nodules from those areas. And that's done as a precautionary principle, just to preserve the area. But there will be an impact, but the question is, what's the alternative? And it's the dirty secret behind electric vehicles. And we know the CO2 cost of producing a car. That cost trebles when you include the battery.
Yeah.
3 times the CO2 impact of making a car. It's 3 times bigger because of the electric vehicle battery. So, we have to find a way of attacking that issue. We have to find a way of finding materials, the metals, particularly nickel and cobalt and copper, that has a much lower environmental and social impact than land-based alternatives. That's what we're busy doing.
How do these deep ocean recovery technologies compare from a CO2 point of view to kind of land-based mining? Is it?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we, over the last 18 months, we funded a white paper, because that's a question that's not easy to answer. And so we funded a very extensive study that looked at a full life cycle analysis of the impact if we were to build 1 billion batteries, which is what the plan for the planet is. In fact, it'll be many billions of batteries when we include home and office, but we just focused on transportation.
Yeah.
And so 1 billion batteries, if we don't change the supply chain, so if we keep getting it from land, but we made allowances for that industry to become more efficient. We made assumptions that they'd start using renewable energy and so on. And then we looked at the alternative of collecting nodules and making battery materials. And if we include sequestered carbon, it means that you can build that battery and generate 90% less CO2 using ocean metals from nodules. And one of the main reasons is the composition and the very high grade of the material. Last year, in fact, in 2018, the average grade of copper mined was less than half of 1%. Now,
wow. So just that 90% less CO2 just for the mineral extraction part, or for the whole
processing? It's from cradle to gate. It's the whole way through. Oh, wow. 90% less. It's and if we take away sequestered carbon, because when you dig up a tree and dig up the soil, you unlock a lot of carbon. So, but if we take that away, just the CO2 gases we pump into the system would be 70% less. So either number is enormous, right?
Yeah, wow.
Either number is enormous. And so, but the main driver for that is the fact that nodule, if I put it in your hand, every single part of it is usable material.
Right.
Every single part of it. Whereas on land,
there's a lot of rock.
It's mainly just rock. Yeah. And you've got to blast it and heat it and refine it. And you're looking for 0.5% copper. So the other 99% you've got to do something with, right? And then you've got to get to the ore body. You've got to move all the overburden aside.
Yeah.
And then just to get to it. And so look, it's an industry that's...
Sorry, just to jump. I initially started the question asking about CO2, but then often, I think the CO2 tends to relate, not always as obviously as I think it should, but tends to relate to the cost. The embodied CO2 in a product tends to kind of relate to the cost of it. So does that mean that actually these materials can be more cost effective than land-based in terms of the extraction cost?
Yeah, totally. I mean, we will operate in the bottom quartile of the cost curve.
Wow.
And
Okay.
once again, that's largely because of the very high grade of the material. And you just need to move a fraction of the amount of material to produce the same amount of metal. And so
Wow.
if we were to, I mentioned 2018, the average grade of copper was less than half of 1%. As you know, our nodules have nickel and cobalt and copper and manganese. If we were to put all of those materials into copper equivalent, just so we could do a side-by-side comparison, our grade of copper would be more than 6.5%. So much higher grade material.
Wow. That's amazing. It does sound like something with a lot of potential in terms of solving one of those big conundrums around the resource availability. So this could be a completely dumb question, but we've talked about NMC. Are there any other kind of rare earth metals down there, or is it just NMC? Well,
no, there are rare earths in all of the nodules,
right.
and we may change our process to extract those,
right.
In phase 2. But phase 1 of our development is to go after the battery materials, and so it's a different process to extract the rare earths, and it's and that will come at a later stage from our perspective. And so, the important thing about the nodules, and one of the other amazing things, when we process them, we generate no tailings. And if you followed world events in places like Brazil, we've seen lots of tailing dams burst. And that's because those materials on land have lots of arsenic and mercury, those deleterious elements that means you can't release them. You've got to store them forever. And we don't have those apart from very small trace signs. And so it means that we don't have to have any tailings dams. It means we get to use 100% of the material. And so the environment is one angle, but there are other aspects to the environment. Not having any tailings dams is a really big plus, because mining companies will find it very challenging to finance projects that have tailings dams, because they have a habit of bursting and wiping out lives and villages. Obviously, child labor is something that is still very commonplace, particularly in markets like the Congo. And so, we'll be able to guarantee all of these things.
People love to show a nice cobalt mine in the Congo as an argument against electric vehicle powertrain. Yeah,
that's right, exactly. But there's an easy solution, and the easy solution, of course, is let's go and collect these ocean metals. And
so, how you mentioned earlier that you surveyed 75,000 square kilometers of ocean floor. The kind of engineer in me is fascinated by how you did that. So what kind of technology is involved, and what kind of effort is involved in surveying 75,000 kilometers at 4,000 meters below? How on earth do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so there's several methods, and one of them is you use a multi-beam survey or something you tow behind the boat, and then you just literally go mapping. You just run over the whole block, obviously using GPS to make sure you know where you are, and then you put together. Basically, it sends a beam to the seafloor, and it responds differently if there's a nodule there or there's not a nodule there. And then you add to that photography. We did a lot of time last year and the year before on using automated underwater vehicles, which they look a little bit like a rocket in shape, and they go off the back of the boat, and they'll fly up to 3 meters above the seafloor. So if it's 4,000 meters minus 3 meters, these are taking really detailed imagery. And we do that so we can then match the resource with the less intense imagery, but also so we can study the environment down there, so we can get clear pictures of organisms. And then the final piece is we do regular box cores. And if you go to our website, which is deep.green, you'll find lots of videos of box coring campaigns. And that's where we correlate the different mapping techniques. And then we take a physical sample. This machine goes off the side of the boat. When it hits the bottom of the seafloor, a piston goes off and it closes. And we bring back an exact sample of the ocean floor. And we obviously study that from a marine life perspective, study the soil, study the water, weigh the nodules, and test their grade so we can see if there's variance between one area and the next.
Wow. So it must be a huge amount of data that you've managed to collect. It's amazing that you can detect things the size of a small potato down at that sort of depth. But
with much more reliability, actually, because if you imagine when you're trying to get a picture of a deposit on land, generally you have to drill holes, right? Because you're trying to imagine what it looks like. And as you make the resource more certain, you drill more regular holes. Yeah. Whereas with ours, it literally just sits there on the seafloor. Think of golf balls on a driving range.
Yeah, even the various kind of techniques for trying to see below the surface on land, the kind of seismic surveying and things like that, and they're all quite. Yeah. There's a bit of an art to it, isn't there? They're not exactly exact in terms of the results you get back. So, the other question that pops to mind is that all sounds quite expensive. So I don't know. As a business, how have you gone about funding this kind of huge activity? I know from my experience, it's hard to raise finance in for sort of risky kind of high tech, high risk kind of projects. And you sound like very high tech, very high risk. So how have you funded this? And if you can tell me, how much does it cost to get this far?
Sure. Well, you're right in everything you say. It's hard raising capital, and we've raised $120 million so far, and despite the difficult market conditions, we're about to raise a new round of capital, which will close in the coming months, including some of our current loyal shareholders participating. But you're right; it's a big, expensive industry, but we're very lucky to have an amazing group of shareholders. Firstly, as an entrepreneur, I invested, and in this next round of capital, I'm investing. Right. And so investors like to see current investors stumping up. And so we have a lot of conversations. We look for like-minded entrepreneurs. We look for people that want to save the planet. We look for people that are concerned about existential risk. And we look for people that are concerned about supply chains, because of course China has done a very good job of securing the supply of battery materials, and that's a risk to developed countries. And so some people are in this because they like the idea of alternative supply. Yeah. And then of course we have our industrial partners like Maersk and Allseas, and they're in businesses that have uncertain futures. If you are servicing the oil and gas offshore industry, and we're at peak oil, and so that industry is oversupplied and will start to contract. And so it's not a very cool industry to be in. And so yet you have all this expertise, you have all these assets that could easily be redeployed, and so that provides a very fertile community for us to be talking to. And so but as we get larger, we'll start to see the electric vehicle companies get involved as well. I guess they're going to have to get through this COVID-19 crisis. We all are. Yeah. But at the other end of it, those companies need reliable supply of battery materials to be able to build the batteries, to be able to sell their cars. And provenance is going to become a big issue. People don't want to be driving a car or using a mobile phone that's being built with the help of child labor, or has been built with the help at the cost of ripping down rainforests.
Yeah,
So
yeah, definitely. But it's such a big topic in the automotive space, and
yeah,
the OEMs are already all sort of trying to secure long-term supplies of fully built up cells, but then right down the supply chain, and like you say, the provenance that's always been a massive, well, not always obviously, but certainly during my career in automotive, component provenance and making sure you haven't broken any regulations and rules in the production is so important to all of the major, certainly US and European OEMs. It's
yes.
I don't think people realise the lengths they go to make sure all the relevant sort of their products are made using safe material. They're all kind of scared of those bad headlines in the future.
But I can also give you a lot of certainty that even if you think you've got a grasp on it, and this comes from understanding the industry a little bit and also talking to those customers, they have no idea, because even though you might be buying material out of a mine where you say, well, I know it came from such and such, it then goes into this massive melting pot that is China. And of course, they're sourcing materials from a whole variety of different vendors. And so I think supply chain provenance will be important. And, as we go forward, being able to measure things and being able to guarantee things, I hope will help us create a great brand, a brand that, using our ocean metals will be able to tell you how much CO2 we generated, how much water was used, because water is about to become a really topical issue for the world.
Yeah.
How much child labor we used? None of it. How many trees? How many trees we cut down? I mean, and I think when you can measure something, other people are going to be consumers will go, well, why can't you measure it? And I want it measured, and I want to know where all this stuff comes from. And so,
is there? You mentioned China, and also you mentioned rightly that the Chinese have been very aggressive in terms of securing their material. I don't know if aggressive is the right word. Very proactive and very long term in terms of their view on securing materials. Are they looking at what you're doing? Are you?
Yeah, totally. Oh yeah. They are. China has secured 3 license areas themselves.
Okay.
And so China, you have to be a sovereign or sponsored by a sovereign to have a license area, because we operate in what's known as the high seas, and the high seas is anything beyond 200 miles from your coastline.
Right.
So about 40% of the planet falls into this category. And it's regulated by the International Seabed Authority. And there are 168 members. You have to be a sovereign. In fact, it's 167 plus the European Union. And so, it's decided. Think of it as the United Nations. It's based in Kingston, Jamaica. It's a very democratic type organization that moves pretty slowly but very thoroughly, and they are essentially the representative owners of the high seas, because there's the principle of the common heritage of mankind, and that means that any assets that are in the high seas are owned by everyone, and they should only be developed for the good of humankind, and the benefits should go to developing nations and so on. So it's another exciting aspect of this project, actually, that never before has an asset been commercially developed that is the common heritage of everyone.
Wow. That sounds really exciting and interesting on one hand, but a potential political bureaucratic minefield on the other. Is it difficult to navigate in that system, or have you managed to?
Well, we've been at it for a long time now, and it moves slowly, but it's very deliberate. And so I think that I'd rather that, because if you think about the developing world, those governments tend to be, challenging landlords, because they often change their rules. Sometimes they'll place economic prosperity or development over the environment or the benefit of everyone. So I think having a central regulator is a really positive benefit of this industry.
Right.
And so, I'd rather that and a little bit more bureaucracy than the alternative.
So it's not quite the Wild West then?
No. Oh my God. It's the opposite. It's the opposite in the sense that everyone's being very safe. Right. I mean, if you think about offshore oil and gas or the mining industry, they all started before they were regulated, right? Whereas we've been regulated forever and we haven't started yet. We won't start commercial production until 2023. And we'll have the eyes of the world on us every day. I fully expect that, and I'm totally fine with that as well.
Wow. So couple more questions. If I think we've still got a bit of time left. In terms of the material composition, I think maybe you might have already answered this question, but just I'll try. So lots of people are trying to get rid of cobalt in particular out of batteries because of the potential, cost, social impact, etc. in mining. Sorry, cobalt. I said copper, didn't I? It's been a long day. Cobalt. We're trying to get rid of cobalt out of batteries. Do you see changing material technology like that as a potential risk? Are you monitoring that closely in terms of what's happening with battery tech? What's your view on that?
Yeah, look, we're monitoring it closely, that's for sure. And we don't see it as a risk. We are hopeful that the world can slow down its use of or its mixture of cobalt in a battery, because while there was a little bit of supply came online last year, when you extrapolate out the most modest transition to electric vehicles, it's going to put lots of pressure on the cobalt market. Now, if you look at, some of the major auto manufacturers last year, they were still making electric vehicle battery cathodes using 1 part nickel to 1 part cobalt. So, that's a lot of cobalt. And so when people say they're designing away from cobalt, we're still, they're still going to have the average battery for a small 4-person passenger car will still have 7 kilograms of cobalt in the battery cathode.
Yeah, I
guess.
Because
it's a very important element in the battery mix. It has a very high resistance to boiling. So.
I guess and you still got the copper and the nickel and the other elements
exactly.
as well.
And let's think about copper. Copper is such a universally in-demand conductor. Nickel, its main market today is to make steel, and so that is not going away. And of course, the great discovery was that more density in the battery cathode gives longer life, and that's what consumers want. They want to be able to drive a car and not run out of juice.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So another question, which is completely different. Sorry, no kind of logical sequence to my random thoughts here. But have you been out there yourself? Have you spent much time sort of out on vessels in the areas that you're looking at?
Our boat is moored in San Diego,
right?
And the honest answer is I haven't actually been to the CCZ, despite the fact that I've invested a big part of my very, very small fortune in the company, largely because an expedition takes more than 6 weeks.
Right.
I did go offshore last year when we had 60 minutes on the boat, and we went out towards the Clarion-Clipperton zone, but we didn't make it all the way. And we went out and met the boat and came back in.
Right.
That was, more for the story. It's, but we actually get to, I know the crew. We have the same rotating crew on that boat. We've had it moored in San Diego for a few years now. I know the crew very, very well. And we're virtually on it when it's out there anyway because of video and satellite coverage. And of course, it forms, a very, very important part of everything we're doing and why we're doing it. And so, but, it's a pretty busy old job running this company. And, I'd love the luxury of 6 weeks off the grid out there. But we're kind of not at that stage just yet. But, some other lucky people in our team get to do that. So.
So what I was going to ask you is what is it like out there? I mean, is it? I've never been on a boat in the high seas. So you see these kind of TV programs with like huge waves and all this kind of thing. Is it like that?
It can be both. I mean, actually, the Pacific Ocean where we are can be very, very calm, but it does have cyclones that rip through it. And we were dodging cyclones on one of our cruises last year, six-week cruise. I think we had to dodge 3 cyclones. They literally came through. They were like a daily thing. And obviously, these boats can handle. They have an amazing crew, crew, of course, and they can handle any seas that get thrown at us. But it's generally pretty calm out there. And in fact, if you go to our website, as I mentioned, www.deep.green, you will see some great little videos that our team have made, which just show you what life's like out there. And you'll be surprised at how calm it is. And in the Pacific Ocean, it's beautiful warm water. Not that we've ever had anyone fall in, but it's about 27 degrees Celsius out there and rising, unfortunately. So
go for a little paddle. 4,000 meters. I'm not sure. Yeah, I definitely. I have a bit of a mental block when it comes to swimming in the ocean. That's one of my. I'm not afraid of much, but I just can't get my head around it for some reason. Just to kind of wrap up then, what are you excited about? So in terms of what the future holds for you guys, what's got you excited now?
Look, this is some people are attracted to impossible challenges, right? I don't think this one's impossible, but it's a big challenge. And what I'm excited about is just putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. I'm about to, get this conversation a little bit more on the front page because I think there's a lot of irresponsible reporting that goes on about this industry, and I think that some of the planet-loving NGOs are behaving, I believe, in an irresponsible way. It comes back to those choices again. We know that there are some impacts of going to the ocean. What we have to do is compare those impacts with the alternatives. And if you take an honest appraisal of that, there's only one place you'll go. There's only one place. You'll go to the oceans so I guess that's a big challenge. And, it's one that I'm motivated to win. We've got an amazing team behind us on this project. Despite the fact that we are a for-profit, I think it's fair to say that, everyone's main motivator here is because they can see the benefit that this will offer the planet. And so it's certainly one of my major motivators in life. I want to look back and think this was a really cool thing to have done. And it helped address one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face. And that is, where on earth are we going to find the metals to facilitate the green transition? Because you've only got to look at those NOx graphs that came out. They've been published now very regularly showing emissions this year compared to the first 3 months of last year. And it shows you what a green transition can do. Burning less fossil fuels in our transportation, our factories, can lead to lowering of global temperatures. And that's what we need to do. If we want to avoid existential risk through climate change, we have to make these moves. And I guess the other little bit of relevance with what's going on at the moment is pandemics have been, well known, that there's a risk of pandemic widespread disease. And here we are, we're in the middle of the one. Wouldn't it have been nicer to have had a little bit more preparation, even though we knew the likelihood was high. And I think climate change is a bit the same. Like, the externalities are there for us to see. Temperatures are rising, sea levels are rising, species are going extinct at unprecedented rates. And so let's do something about it. So,
I mean, the current pandemic, you know, so someone said to me the other day who knows far more about it than I understand, but they were saying, you know, it's a matter of when, and actually we've been well overdue for a while. One of the interesting things from my perspective is that, you know, it should bring public health into sharp focus because of the impact of air quality and underlying health conditions, respiratory issues and such like. You know, it's basically, if we want to build a more resilient society, we've got to start taking public health seriously. And then, you know, I think the trouble is, so climate change, people start to get it now because they can see the immediate kind of impacts around them. But it is a bit like, it is still, I think, a bit too abstract for a lot of people, which is, with pandemic, I think the trouble the last, 10, 15 years, it's abstract. It's not a problem until it's a problem. And the trouble with climate change, it'll be a much bigger problem than this pandemic. Maybe not such short and sharp, but sort of, I've heard things like uninsurable planet by 2050, massive weather events and things, which are getting more and more common already. But it's just quite, obviously everyone is obsessed with the pandemic right now, and rightly so. But then, I kind of hope that we don't quite go back to business as usual afterwards, that we do start to think, you know what, we need to prepare better for these things. We need to put more effort in while we can,
So, I hope so. Ryan, I hope you're right.
Yeah, we'll see.
Let's hold you out a little bit towards it.
Yeah, well, and hopefully, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you, Gerard. Thank you so much for making the time to do this. It's definitely something that, well, I had no idea what a nodule was, to be honest. And you've really answered all of my questions very well in terms of what it is you guys are doing. And it seems obvious to me, having spoken to you, the potential in it. So, I really do wish you the best of luck, and hope that we start to see good, clean, low CO2 products coming out in, was it 2020? 2023. Yeah,
thanks, Brian. I've enjoyed it. And for any of your listeners, follow us on social media. We're looking to build a fan base. So come and follow us and participate.
Yeah, I'll put some links in the show notes to your website and your various social media things, so people can go and investigate some more. So that's great. Thank you, Gerard.
Thanks, Ryan.
So that's all we've got time for today. I have found that absolutely fascinating. What a pleasure to talk to Gerard and understand more about DeepGreen and what they are doing. As I said in the podcast, we'll stick some links in the show notes below. So if you want to find out more about what they're up to, go down and click on those and go and have a look. Don't forget to follow us, subscribe to our channel, like this, share it if you found it useful and interesting. We've seen our views and listens and things actually rise massively in the last couple of weeks. People are watching and listening to our stuff as I guess they're stuck at home with nothing better to do. So maybe someone who could benefit from listening to some of our podcasts, or don't forget our YouTube channel, watching some of our videos on YouTube. So thanks very much for taking the time to listen to us today, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.